Major 2 Grand Finals are done and OCE'S 2 Global Championship spots are locked in. This one went right down to the last game, 4 points covering the top 3 going into game 12. 2 tickets to Belgium are on the line. It's about as close as a Grand Finals can get. We've got a team that led after day 1 and are genuinely having a rough day 2. We're going to dig straight into that one properly because the stats were telling you it was coming if you knew where to look. We have a duo that was nowhere after day 1 and completely flipped the tournament on day 2. And there was one player who topped basically every damage board in the region on the same weekend. But we'll get to that at the end because it's pretty sick. There's plenty to go through for this one, so let's get into it. Resigns and Tinker had a dominant day 1, 3 wins out of 4 games, and finished second overall on the day. Their match history was ridiculous. 6 kill win in game 1, 5 kill win in game 3, and a 6 kill win in game 4. But look what happened in between. Game 2, they went 32nd for 8 points. Game 5 and 6, they went 13th and 26th. So their day 1 ends up being 263 points from 3 games, and only 42 points from the other 3. That's just who this duo is. When they're on, they win the lobby outright, and when they're off, there's nothing there. The team that actually led overnight was Kazi and Aspect, and they did it without winning a single game. They went 8th, 2nd, 5th, 6th, 9th, 5 top 10s in a row to open a grand finals. Then, in game 6, they went 43rd and got nothing. And that's because they were still sitting on first on 314 because the points lead was already that big. That's a really strong day 1. You can't take that off them. But it's also the kind of day 1 that leaves you with nothing to fall back on, and that becomes very relevant on the next day. Alex and Reckless won game 2 with 97 points, the biggest score of the day, and then went 46, 56, and 42nd, 16 points over 3 games. That put them in 6 overnight. They were landing on one of the most contested spots on the map the whole weekend. Triple conned most of the games and still managed to drop the highest single game score of the tournament. That's the part that still feels a bit crazy when you look back at it. So going into day 2, you've got 20 points covering the top 3. If you're watching at that point, most people would have said this was Kazi and Aspect to lose. Kazi and Aspect scored 122 points on day 2. That's the whole day. They held on for the first 2 games with a 10th and an 8th, and then it just fell apart. Game 9, they went 43rd with no elims. Game 10, they went 17th. Game 11 and 12, they went 30th twice and got nothing out of it either of them. 0 elims in their last 4 games of the tournament. First after day 1, 9th overall. But here's the part we find really interesting because the stats were telling you this from the start. Aspect finished 3rd in the entire lobby for time spent in Storm at 70 minutes and 35 seconds. Kazi was 5th on 70 minutes and 7 seconds across 12 games. Those two spent more time taking storm damage than almost anyone in the region. Then you look at their shotgun ratio. Kazi was on 0.98 and Aspect was on 0.87. Anything under 1 means you're coming off worse in those fights more often than not. Both of them were under 1 across an entire grand finals. So what you're looking at is a duo that played the very edge of zone and avoided fights wherever they could. And honestly, it worked really well for 6 games. 5 top 10s, no wins, top of the leaderboard. The problem is when the lobby starts getting harder and teams start giving you that free edge, there is nothing underneath it. No wins banked, no elim points, and nothing to fall back on. And that's exactly what happened. For a bit of comparison, the player who ends up winning the whole thing spent 33 minutes in Storm, less than half of what Kazi did, and his shotgun ratio was 2.42. Day 2 was a completely different tournament, and you can see it in the winners. Game 7 was Oatly and Gerald with 10 elims. Game 8 was Solvi and Cesars with 10. Game 9 was Vazen and Xavier with 10. Game 10 was Alex and Reckless with 13. Game 11 was Anon and Minty with 11. 5 of the 6 day 2 winners had double-digit kills. The average winner on day 1 had 5.8 elims. On day 2, it was 10.2. The winning score went from 88 points up to 106. On day 1, you could place your way to the top of the leaderboard. On day 2, that stopped working, and it stopped working for everybody, not just Kazi and Aspect. Game 10 is the one people are going to remember. Alex and Reckless, 13 elims, 117 points. Comfortably the biggest single game anyone had all tournament. It put them first overall on 488 points with 2 games to play. And at that point, people thought they were going to go to Belgium. Going into the final game, it was Alex and Reckless on 488 points. Resigns and Tinker on 485, and Solvi and Cesars on 484. 4 points covering 3 teams. There's only 2 global spots, and 1 game left. That's as good as it gets. Resigns and Tinker finished second in that game with 7 elims for 84 points. Solvi and Caesars went 11th for 38. Alex and Reckless went 17 with 2 elims for 28 points. So Alex and Reckless, who had the most elims in the tournament, the biggest single game in the tournament, and were going first into the last game, ended up third and miss out on your global spot. That's a rough way to lose it. Let's go through the top 3 properly, starting with the wins. Resigns and Tinker won 3 games on day 1 and none on day 2. And day 2 is actually where they won the tournament, which is not what you'd expect. Their first 3 games back were 19th, 20th, and 24th. Nothing games. Then they went 6th, 9th, and closed it out with a 2nd place. They stopped winning games and started just consistently banking points in a lobby that had gotten a lot harder, that turned out to be the version that held up. It's also worth pointing out that their early game, they were sat on by Harry and Fisher God and bullied them. 1,140 damage dealt to 185 taken. That's the 2nd most lopsided early game matchup the entire tournament. They were getting a very clean start most games. Solvi and Caesars were 9th after day 1 and they're going to Belgium. That's probably the story of the tournament for me. They opened the event 43rd, 13th, and 27th. About as a bad start as you can have and still qualify. Then they put up 301 points on day 2, more than anyone else in the lobby managed. If you look at their individual rankings, it makes a lot more sense. Solvi was 2nd in the region for zone 8 to 12 damage, so endgame damage. Caesars was 3rd in elims and 4th in builds placed. They weren't doing much early. They were just doing all their damage in the part of the game that actually pays out. Game 8, they got 10 elims for 105 points. And then game 10, they backed it up with a 2nd place. Those 2 games are basically the entire qualification. Then you have Alex and Reckless, which this one does sting. Alex had 35 elims on his own, most in the region and 9 clear of 2nd. Reckless was 3rd in endgame damage. Alex was 4th in total damage and 5th in damage ratio. On paper, this duo did everything. But if you look at their placements, you can see exactly what went wrong. First, they're 42nd. 2nd, 48th. They win game 10 and then go 32nd in game 11. 4 games at 42nd or worse across the tournament. You just can't do that in 12 game finals and expect to get away with it. Game 9 is the one that cost them. 48th, 0 elims, 0 points. 1 game after they finished 2nd. Anything at all out of that game and they're in the qualification spot instead of Solvi and Caesars. But they still have the last chance qualifier though, so this isn't necessarily the end of it for them. We said at the start that one player basically won every damage category, and that player was Resigns. Most damage dealt in the region, 8,605. That's first place. Shotgun damage, 4,061. First. Damage ratio, 2.18. First place. Zone 8 to 12 damage, 4,274. That's also first. Total damage, shotgun damage, efficiency, and endgame damage. He topped all 4 of them, and nobody else in the tournament finished first in more than 1 category. He was also 2nd in mats farmed as well. He wins the tournament and tops every meaningful damage board in the region on the same weekend. That's about as complete run as a grand finals gets. The stat we actually think is the most interesting one out of all of this is the zone 8 to 12 damage. That's just the damage dealt in the last 5 zones. The part of the game where the lobby is small and points genuinely change hands. Resigns was 1st on 4,274. Solvi was 2nd on 4,052. Reckless was 3rd on 3,859. And those 3 teams finished 1st, 2nd, and 3rd overall in that exact order. Over 12 games, that's not a coincidence. It's probably the clearest thing in the whole data set which actually wins these tournaments. But here's a few other ones worth mentioning before we finish. Swooks and Damo did 28,309 team damage. The 2nd most in the lobby was Anon and Minty at 21,949. That's a 6.4 thousand gap between them and nobody was near them. Spooks was 2nd in elims and Damo was 3rd in solo clutch points. They finished 6th with no wins, which is a pretty good reminder that damage on its own doesn't do a lot for you. Anon topped solo clutch points with 111. Gerald was on 2nd with 99. Crusades farmed 26,021 mats, the most in the lobby, and also took 648 full damage, which was the most in the lobby. And Drizzle got revived or rebooted 10 times across the tournament. The next closest was 5. But that's Major 2 done. Resigns and Tinker and Solvi and Caesars are OCE'S 2 duos heading to Belgium in the summer. And of course, one more spot in the last chance globals. If you take one thing out of this tournament, it's that day one didn't decide anything. Solvi and Stasies were 9th after day one and they qualified. Kazi and Aspect were 1st after day one and finished 9th. Alex and Reckless had more elims than anybody in the region and missed out by 6 points. The last chance qualifier is next, so we'll have coverage of that. Like and subscribe if you want it when it drops.